I think sometimes our teachers are dealing with levels of stress in ways that they don't even recognize either until they actually have a moment to be asked, like, so how are you doing?
Right.
And I think leaders are in that place too, because they're often the ones nobody asks, how are you doing?
Right.
So let's get started, because I know
Yes.
we're already
Sounds good.
we're already we're already doing it. Principal Matters Podcast, episode 267. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. And this week, I'm joined by my co-host, Jen Schwanke, an education leader from Dublin City Schools in Dublin, Ohio, and the author of two great books on school leadership. Jen, welcome back to Principal Matters Podcast. And as I stumble through that introduction, I hope you're having a great day.
I am. And it's great to be back. We've got some good questions to think through today. And I hope that the listeners will really find value in some of the ideas we're going to throw out there.
Well, as we jump into this week's episode with Principal Questions Part 2, if you want to go back and listen to Jen and I talk from last week's conversation, you can go back to episode 266. But wow, we've got some really great questions here, Jen. And we're just going to go ahead and jump straight into the hardest one, I think, which is the question, how do you manage leading a school through the grief of losing a teacher to COVID? And I know this is not a novel question for our listeners. You have talked to principals already this year, this semester, who have walked through the grief. I know a principal at an elementary school in our state who's managed the death of two teachers. I know a high school principal who just about 2 weeks ago managed the death of a young teacher in that building. And so these are questions that when leaders are stepping into meetings, sometimes the weight that they're carrying for what their schools are going through is so much deeper than just curriculum and managing schedules and helping kids at lines and welcoming parents in the mornings. There's a lot of grief, Jen. And so as we talk to leaders about those questions, let's just reflect a little bit. What are some thoughts that come to mind? And I'll be glad to add my own as well.
When we were plugging in our microphones to prepare for today, I was thinking about grief and how layered it is. And, a lot of administrators have experienced some sort of devastating loss to their school community. Unfortunately, it's a club none of us want to join, but most of us will at some point in our careers. And I was thinking how complicated a loss because of COVID really is for principals, because grief is loss and you have to work through that and all the feelings that come with it. But the layer of COVID intensifies it, because COVID is scary, and it's something that could happen to any of us. And it's unexpected in the sense that, all of us think, well, I wouldn't get that sick. And so there's that fear when it hits so close to home, that someone that we've worked with and attended baby showers with and endured parent teacher conferences with, now they were the ones. It's so close. And so we deal with fear and loss very differently. And I think loss takes time and it takes community to work through it. Fear takes action, at least for me. I when I'm scared or I'm frightened, I want to do something. And the problem here is that with COVID, the thing you do is you isolate, right? If you're scared of how COVID might affect you, or your immune system is compromised in some way, you isolate. And that obviously is the opposite of what we need to do to manage loss. So that reconciliation needs to happen somehow. And I think it's different for different types of people. And all that is to say, I think that leaves principals in a very tricky spot, because, they'll want to bring their community together to grieve, but fear makes it so coming together is not the most comfortable place. And you know what? I always go back to what has helped me in times of intense grief. And that is to go back and revisit the stages of grief, because I can find myself in those, and I will read them. I think it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I said that quickly because I don't want to mess up her name, but she first introduced the stages of grief. And I will literally pull out the book and read through the stages, because it helps me ground myself to know that there is a process that the heart needs to go through it during these times.
I appreciate that, Jen. And I think that's so helpful. I think the thoughts that I would add is sometimes when we're trying to help our students and our teachers and our communities manage grief, there's not always a place for the principal to manage grief. And I say that because you know, in I think if you've been in school leadership long enough, you've managed grief. I mean, before COVID, I've been in schools where we've lost teachers. I've been in schools where we've lost students. I've been in schools where we've lost dear community members. And it's never an easy process, but often in those processes, you're the one who's stepping forward with the boldness and the courage, and you're the one who's gathering people, or maybe even the one delivering the news of what's happening for your school community. And sometimes you don't have a moment where you can just shut the door and just grieve yourself. And so I just want to give school leaders permission to recognize that you're carrying a weight of grief too when you're in those situations. And it's okay to recognize that those stages of grief that your folks are experiencing, you're experiencing too. Right. And it does affect the way you lead. You can't deny that kind of emotion will begin to tinge sometimes the way you're thinking or feeling. And so sometimes you need to pull away and just even if it's just a small moment to embrace the way you're feeling and then step back in, but recognize the kind of stress that puts on you too, emotionally and physically.
I'm glad you said that. I had a principal call me actually from Michigan last week, and she said, teachers keep saying no one is asking about us. Nobody cares how we're feeling. And she said, every time she hears that, she thinks no one asks about me either, which of course is, you don't want to get in a suffering contest, like who has it worse. But as a principal, that's part of your job, is to carry the feelings and the emotions of the people who are working in your building. And my worry for principals who don't care for themselves, as you just explained, are that they'll get stuck in one of the stages. So just to bring it back to that, first you have your denial, then your anger, then your bargaining, and then comes the depression. And that's where I worry that principals can get stuck. Mm-hmm. They can go through this leading their staff. And then if they don't care for themselves, then they're going to go to a low place that's really hard to claw out of without some help. So I think getting help, doing any kind of outreach, whether it's in your personal world or some resources that are out there, it's important to take care of ourselves too, because that principal that called me was right. Nobody stops and says, hey, let's see how the principal's doing. And I guess I want to walk that back a little. Some people do. I think that there are those really caring, empathetic souls on every staff who will stop by and say, hey, how are you, to the principal? And that really means a lot. But in the absence of those people checking in, I think we sometimes have to self-initiate a little and get the support we need.
That's great. And within this context of, I think we've set the stage in terms of recognizing the emotions that are involved with grief, but let me take just a couple of minutes and give some practical suggestions too for leaders. And I'm actually going to refer back to something that I wrote about a long time ago, Jen, when we lost it was a tragic situation in our school when we lost one of our students. And it was a very public situation. It was a hard situation. It was close to graduation, a senior in our school. And so there was a lot of grief that our community was facing. And I actually sat down at the time and I wrote myself some notes as we walked through that situation as a school community. And I've come back to these notes, sadly, the next time something happened. And so here's a few things that I'm going to pull from those lessons that I think also apply now. One is the importance of your role as a school leader to be a strong communicator. When you know something, people need to know what you know, as long as you're not breaching confidentiality. So it's just really important that you keep your communication forward and strong because you are the spokesperson on behalf of your school community. And so sometimes it's important for you to be a voice to the parents and other kids within your community if you have, and again, sometimes these have to be done within the constraints of district messaging, but I think it's important for principals to be prepared to be that messenger to their teachers and to the students and to the community of our hearts are broken. This is what we're struggling through right now. And on behalf of our school district, we want to provide support to this family, et cetera. The second thing I think that's important for principals to remember is just the power of your presence and visibility. Sometimes you don't need to say anything at all. After you've made a statement, you just need to be present, because sometimes people need just your presence sometimes provides people with that extra measure of just knowing, hey, it's a hard day today, but I just looked up and saw Ms. Schwanke. I just looked up and saw Mr. Parker. I just looked up and saw my leader. And I just feel supported by seeing the person who's there for me. The third thing I would say is just maintain as much stability and routine as you can, because when you're going through grief, sometimes the best remedy for healing is routine. Is just stepping back in and making sure that things can go back to as normal as they can, but within that routine, providing opportunities for people to step away if they need help. And so making sure that routine is there with support provided and available for people that are struggling or that may need a place to just go and talk or grieve. The fourth thing I would say is allow for creativity or spontaneous responses from your school community. Somebody may want to do something to remember that person, or they may want to plant a tree or whatever. Don't be that damper on people's spontaneity and creativity. Allow them. I'll tell a quick story, Jen. We had a teacher who, the day after we had lost that senior student, in the math class that student attended, the teacher was inviting kids in, getting ready to call roll and teach. And when she looked out across the students, it was obvious that they were not ready to learn. There were tears, there was anxiety, and this was a close-knit class. And so one of the kids just spontaneously said, I have a Sharpie. Could I write a note on the desk of the student that we lost? And that teacher did the right thing at that moment. She didn't come ask me permission. She was like, let's circle up. And every one of those students that hour took time to just write notes on the desk of that kid when we gave that desk to that family. That was something that was spontaneous and creative, but allowed those kids an opportunity to heal. And if you're leading a community right now that's facing, grief, don't push back when you've got people that want to do things that are spontaneous. And then the last thing I'll say is, don't be afraid to ask for help outside of your school community. There are people within your communities who are really good at providing additional support. So whether that's bringing in additional district counselors or allowing your faith community to provide folks that will connect with kids or people in your school that share that same faith, I think that's super important too. So I hope those are helpful. I'll add a link to that post from a previous conversation I've had, Jen. But that just came to me as we were talking about this, because I think grief is something that those lessons can be shared from across time too.
And I love that they came from a place of experience too, because a lot of times when we lose a student or a staff member in a school, we feel so alone. We feel like, okay, we're the one person who will navigate this, but how do I do it? How many ways can I mess this up? Everybody's looking at me and I don't know. And I think it's important to remember a lot of principals have been through it, and they may have taken notes as you did, or they may have a mental file, and, to reach out and ask for help or to learn from the experiences of others will certainly make it more seamless. And the other thing I might add is, and you certainly alluded to this, is it's okay to feel pretty ripped apart yourself and to show that, because being vulnerable and being fragile and being real are things that a staff is looking to see in a leader. And that doesn't mean you open a staff meeting with a big long cry. That means you show what strength looks like, and you allow them to know that you're in pain as well. And that's where the community comes in. That's where healing begins, is by looking around and seeing that whoever this person is that's no longer with us is going to be missed collectively.
Well, and I'll add one more resource. You and I were talking about this before we opened the recording, but a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in PD with an experienced educator. It was actually an instruction on trauma-informed strategies. How do you work with students in trauma? And the instructor pulled out a book, an elementary book called The Rough Patch by Brian Lies, which is just a beautiful story of an animation, a fox who's a gardener who loses his best friend dog. And so it's just a touching story about how he responds to his loss and the difficulty that he goes through, but it's written in a way that's so sensitive to the sensibilities of children. But I found myself, while she was just reading this children's book, getting emotional. I had to step out of the room for a minute, because I think sometimes we don't even recognize ourselves how we're dealing with the grief of those in our own lives and the people around us that are struggling, until we actually have permission to think about it. And so if you lead an elementary school, maybe that's a good time to pull out one of those books that you would be reading to kiddos and model that with your teachers. Or maybe it's an opportunity for you to just close your door and read that book to yourself. But I'll provide a link to The Rough Patch if you want to pick up a copy of that book, because I have a copy of it on my desk now, Jen, because it's just a comforting reminder that all of us go through rough patches.
And that, by the way, is a great tip for administrators. If you can't find the words or you don't know how to lead the conversation, there are some wonderful resources out there that are short, children's books, quick reads, and you can just read it to your staff, close the book, and then let them talk. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't even have to be words. You can poach words from other people who are poetic and kind and compassionate as you are, and you don't have to find new words. A lot of times a opening like that is more powerful than anything you could have put together on your own. So embrace the experts, I guess we can say.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump into question 2 this week. The first question I know was a difficult one for us to talk through. Managing and leading schools through grief is not an easy topic, Jen, to talk about. And listeners, if you've got additional comments or resources or ideas that you want to add to this conversation, please do. Or you can reach out to me at will@williamdparker.com, or Jen at her contact information as well. And just provide us with some of the feedback that you've had, or even the experiences that you've had that might be helpful for others to know too. Jen, the second question that we have this week from practicing principals is a question on escalations of behaviors as we've transitioned back from COVID. I was sitting in a PD yesterday I'm a big fan of Growing Leaders, and they had just put out a book on students' emotional anxiety coming back from COVID. And there were about 165 educators in this Zoom, and the question he posed at the beginning was, what are some samples of anxiety or stress you're seeing among your students as they returned? Oh my gosh, the chat just was blowing up with just examples of kids and the kinds of escalated behaviors that people are seeing as a result of them transitioning back in. And so I'm sure you could fill in the gap, principals that are listening to this right now, but I saw responses about kids, some kids who are more withdrawn, other kids who are more aggressive, kids that are having a difficult time managing the way that they're responding to teacher input. I don't know, Jen, you could add to that list in terms of those behaviors.
Yeah, what I'm hearing a lot of from principals, I'm so lucky to have principals really across the country that reach out to me and share some of their thoughts. And what I'm hearing is it seems like there was a little bit of a maturity lapse. So, I talked to a principal who said, actually, it was a superintendent who works with principals on all three levels. And he said it seems like the 5-year-olds are 3 and the 7th graders are 5th graders and the sophomores are 8th graders and the seniors are sophomores. And, whether that's true or not, he said that that's what he's hearing over and over. And really that makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense because we had that length of time that we weren't with our students. They weren't in the same traditional environment. And so the behaviors that drove them for the past 2 years are what they think they're bringing to the table now. And so, I've thought a lot about this, and this is not my new thinking, but a lot of experts out there remind us that we teach students math, we teach students science, and we need to teach behaviors too. And And, I think we all anticipated an instructional loss, but we all thought the kids would be so happy to be back that they would come and do exactly what we asked or what we expected. But we're going to have to go back and teach some of the behaviors that we expect. And I know that sounds like common sense. And if there's teachers listening, they're probably thinking, well, of course, but they're just not learning. I'm trying to teach and they're not learning them. And so addressing that might take different tools. And that's where I would call on teachers and principals and superintendents to really provide the PD, the book studies, reach out to some specialists if needed, use the parents as a bridge between the school and the student so that everybody's kind of on the same page. My superintendent and I were talking about this not long ago, and he's a really smart guy. He pointed out that the Latin root for the word discipline means to learn. And so in schools, we don't punish. We shouldn't punish. We should discipline. We should work with our young people who make mistakes or who perhaps don't have the behaviors that we want them to have at that point in their maturity. But the purpose of school discipline is to teach our students. And so as we navigate through the discipline referrals that come to the office and the tricky behaviors that students might be showing, we should do it with the lens of teaching them how to better respond. And that to me is very helpful. It's very grounding.
Well, what I like about that, Jen, is it's such a good reminder. I think you and I were talking months ago when we started hearing a lot of feedback about learning gaps. And I think you were one of the first persons that helped me rethink, like, are we forgetting how resilient kids are? That this is unfinished learning, but there's certainly this gap is not going to last forever. And I know that some of the research you look at will talk about that when students get behind in certain kinds of learning, or if there's too much gap in the summer, then they have such a hard time catching up. And that can be pretty daunting when you look at the research of the learning slides that happen. But you and I both know that if you step in front of a room of kids with the mindset that I'm trying to catch you up, that's not the place to start in terms of helping them achieve the goals that you have set for them. And that content, the math, the science, the reading, all of those things have to happen within the context first of learned behaviors. And so when you face those immature behaviors, and I know, when I was in the classroom for 11 years before the 14, I served as a principal. And Jen, you were a veteran classroom teacher too. Even on a normal, quote unquote, normal year, I always felt my kids were more immature every year. And I think part of that's because the reality is I'm getting older every year. And they're the same age development stepping in every year. But I do have to affirm that people feel like that they're seeing the developmental stages of these kids having some gaps because of how long they've been out of school. And so give yourself permission, like you just said earlier, to pause and make sure that you're taking time to teach behavior as much as you're teaching content. And you and I both know that if you take time to work on those procedures and behaviors and expectations first, then you have the context for the learning that happens too. And that's not to say it's easy, but it's certainly just as important. And so even at the high school level, when I taught juniors, I would start off with, I was probably too much into Harry Wong for a high school teacher, but you know why? It worked. And so I would spend the first several days of my high school juniors, I'll just use them as an example, walking through, how do we come into class? How do we pass in papers? How do we check for makeup work? How do we work when we're sitting in a group? How do we address concerns? How do we have difficult conversations and give each other turns? So if we need to do that with older learners, and frankly, Jen, you and I do that when we do PD with educators. We set the norms, we determine what the behaviors are going to be before we ever step into content. Then I think it's important to give yourself permission, leaders who are listening to this right now, that as you're encountering those things, it's important, I think, to give yourself permission to spend time reviewing behavior instruction as much as we do content instruction.
Right. And I think for it is the job of the principal to remind teachers that discipline and instruction can be interwoven together. I received a phone call from a teacher, from a principal. She was really, really upset because there's in her school, the eighth graders go on this really fun field trip to a pumpkin patch every year. And it's something everybody looks forward to. And she was a new principal to the building and felt that the teachers were holding this trip over the heads of students as if they were trying to catch students in situations where they could pull them from the field trip. And there was one particular student who was late every single day, and the teachers were tired of it. They're sick of it. And so they set up some sort of a demerit system. And sure enough, in about 2 days, he was no longer eligible for the field trip. And so I talked this principal through it, and I said, let's remember too, student tardiness is always, well, no, maybe not always, usually a parent problem. And we've talked a lot about don't discipline or punish a child for a parent's actions. In this case, we have to extend our empathy about the COVID trauma to parents as well. So we don't know what was happening in this student's home, why he was tardy, what was going on at home, that there wasn't any support to get him to school on time. But again, if you draw a linear line between the behavior of the parent and the student and missing the highlight of the fall of an eighth grade year, I said to the principal, what would make this child want to be on time? Now that he can't go to the field trip and he knows everybody's kind of sick of him being late, like there's no motivator there at all. And so that brings me back to instruction. To be punitive or to take something very important away is not the answer. Now, the challenge comes when a principal is standing alone in that philosophy, because she said, I'm looking at my team and nobody wants him to go. And I said, and that, my friend, is where the courage comes in, the courage to communicate and to really try to get them to understand your perspective. At the end of the day, you need to stick up for the child. And even if they're mad at you for 6 months, they'll know you're going to stick up for a student. And I'll take that exchange. I'll take that exchange anytime if I can sleep at night because I stuck up for a student who needed me to. It's complicated times for everyone, parents, students, teachers. It's really, really hard. And so if we keep our eyes focused on trying to help students through this, I think we'll be okay. I really do.
I do too. And Jen, I'll point to another resource because your story just reminded me of my friend Don Parker. He's the author of the book Building Bridges, Engaging Students at Risk Through the Power of Relationships. And he's the principal of Posen Intermediate School in Posen Robbins School Districts near Chicago. And I talked to him probably a year ago on a podcast episode, and Don shared with me the story of working in an at-risk student. And Don is a former athlete himself. And so he discovered that the student loved basketball. And so once he figured out who the student's favorite basketball player was, he knew that punishment was not going to be what motivated this kid to come to school and perform. So instead, through their relationship building, Don decided to buy a few T-shirts that were connected to this basketball player and provide them as incentives. If I see you come to school so many days in a row, this shirt is yours. If I see you achieving this grade, this average of grades over the next few weeks, this next shirt is yours. And he was able to, through that relationship, build incentives with this student to get that student to the point where he was becoming a producing student who was engaging in school productively. And this was the student who had come in with all kinds of baggage, discipline, trauma, all kinds of difficulties. And Don's whole point in that example is that the same point you're making, which is, when we dive into when we can see school through the eyes of our kids, then how do we adjust our learning and discipline to meet them where they are and build bridges with them to help them get where we want them to be? And is that easy? No. Is it messy? Yes. Can we do it perfectly? Nope. But we can certainly improve and grow in the way that we respond to student behavior. So Principal Matters listeners, I know that as we wrap up this week's episode, those are two disparate, they seem like two different questions, but I actually think they're connected. We've got a lot of people that are dealing with grief over legitimate loss of life that's happened within their schools, but we also have students that are coming back in who may be behind or maybe more immature, who've been through a lot of additional trauma, no matter what kind of family they're from. Because of what COVID has done to our society and to our schools and to the mindsets of our teachers and leaders. So we don't share any of this because Jen and I haven't figured out. We just share this because these are the questions we're hearing from leaders. And together we can remind ourselves of solutions that have been helpful in the past and that may continue to be helpful and hopefully can be helpful in the future.
And I'm going to use that opportunity too, Will, to jump in with something we said before we started recording. We both acknowledged to each other, we are not counselors. We are not experts in this. We are principals and we're leaders. And so we've seen it from that perspective, but counselors are out there willing to help, and employee assistant programs, the social workers, those sorts of things are resources that should be utilized. Don't take Will and I as counselors. We are just principals, and we're just doing the same work you are and learning alongside you.
That's what I say all the time. I'm not a licensed therapist. I may be a licensed principal and a licensed instruction, whatever you want to call me. I may be a certified leadership coach, but I am not a licensed therapist. Well, Jen Schwanke, thank you so much for your input. And Principal Matters listeners, if you have questions that you'd like to follow up with either Jen or with me, please reach out to us. You can find all of my resources at williamdparker.com. And Jen, remind folks where they can find yours.
At jenschwanke.com. Very easy.
Thank you, folks, for listening this week, and thanks for doing what matters. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, everyone.